African cities face a myriad of challenges, which have been highlighted by the impact of COVID-19. A rethink of urban development and city management is needed in the light of this shock, coming on top of persistently high unemployment and inequality, as well as poverty in South Africa, and particularly our cities. The pandemic represents an opportunity to recalibrate and innovate in a city management and also urban development for the greater good of society. This session will provide an opportunity to explore some of those possibilities. There are many interesting governance questions that have emerged over the duration of the pandemic, where COVID-19 has both revealed the flaws in existing governance systems and shone a spotlight on them. And this session will really be an opportunity for all of us to engage on this question, both as panelists and as well as the invited guests, those who are participating. We'd very much like to encourage your participation. And we'll look to extract broader governance lessons from the experience of COVID-19 and also the other similar epidemics and shocks that may affect us in the future. And I'm especially pleased to welcome and also have a perspective from Kenya in the person of Rapudo Howie. Always good to get a regional and continental perspective. So we'll start the session with a 15-minute screening of a film from the Goodhood Stories series, which is a series that was stories of creativity, collaboration, and innovation in South African cities that was initiated by the South African Cities Network over the last year. And indeed, this film series was nominated for an international award at a film festival in Detroit last month for an international urban film festival. So if I can ask my colleague Yasmin to play the video, please.
Helenvale in Gqeberha has to be one of the toughest areas in the world to implement urban projects. It has the highest number of gangs per square meter in the entire Eastern Cape province. Yet, for almost a decade, the Mandela Bay Development Agency has been implementing a wide range of interventions, from buildings and public spaces to counselling, training and support. It has rewritten how projects like these are implemented in township contexts, and it has managed to build bridges between gangs, residents, ward councillors and business. The Helenvale SPUU is the most complex and fulfilling project the Mandela Bay Development Agency has embarked on in their 17 years of existence. Helenvale is a township in Gqeberha which was planned in apartheid and is home to 21,000 residents in 6,000 homes. The residents are plagued with severe social and economic challenges. Despite these challenges, the team at the MBDA have been able to implement the program they call Safety and Peace through Urban Upgrading. I meet Debbie Hendricks, Operations Manager. She shares with us some of the insights gained through the project's implementation. George Jerry, a social facilitator, has been working at the MBDA. He has brought over 30 years of experience in political activism to create a model for a people-centered approach to community development.
Development is not just about the bricks and mortar, it's about developing the person.
We are not here to stop gang violence. That's the job of the police. We are not interfering in the gangs and those kind of things. Through our programs, we hope that gang members or young people would be enticed to participate in the programs. So it's kind of a more indirect approach. So we have no business to be in conflict with a gang member. But when we do a project in his or her street, you're welcome, you participate in the meetings, you can join. Mm-hmm. So we respected them as people, and for us, they were part of the Helenvale community. They are not separate from the Helenvale community.
So in Helenvale, there was a lobby group of people that said, we are asking the president of the country to come here. They wrote him a letter and said, come and talk to us. Stop ignoring us, come and talk to us. We need a bit of help. And it wasn't a government department or the municipality, it was ground roots people, aunties and uncles that had interest for their kids that said, is there not something we can do? How can we just be bystanders? It's going to take all hands on deck, and that you can only moan at the government for so long.
While the MBDA has implemented a range of built interventions to improve the community, the psychosocial aspect of the project has been the most impactful. After the Helenvale Resource Centre became a no-go zone due to gang tensions, the MBDA had to come up with an alternative solution to remain effective in maintaining safety and peace throughout the ward. They implemented counselling access points providing support to victims of gender-based and domestic violence, as well as youth career guidance.
So if you talk the schools, they would mention dropouts, children, being abused at home and not having a place to go to. So the counseling centers was an automatic response to that. So whatever we are doing in psychosocial was basically identified by the community and say that, is it possible, MBDA, can you help? And understanding in the bigger picture, you need to deal with the social ills if you want to achieve safety and peace.
So there are people at the bottom area that will never come here. The people from the top area that will never come here. So when we said, but the projects were all over, and the projects are for everybody.
So we had two options. We had the MBDA building or the stadium. And we were looking in terms of what is more resourceful, and we came to the stadium.
It came at a time when the projects has halted. There were a lot of victimization, contractors being gun-pointed, run off the sites, gang fights, the area being too volatile for contract workers to come in, for staff to come in. And so everything just ground to a halt. And we then got brutally honest with the community to say, this is yours to lose. What are we as a collective, but essentially the community of Helenvale going to do to ensure that that doesn't happen? So we need safety on the sites. We need commitment from all the structures that whatever happens on site, we will keep talking. We will not stop the project. The bus can move. You can talk on a moving bus. The bus doesn't have to stop to talk. So there's no reason to stop a project. Everything can be resolved. The agency is fairly small, so it's a small engine, but it's got a lot of agility to do things a lot quicker than a municipality can typically do, and conclude a lot more partnerships with different entities and community organizations, etc., that the municipality struggles to do. So over the years, there's been a number, obviously the KfW Bank being the main funder, but I mean that's led to other initiatives like with GIZ, but the government departments, the Department of Education, Department of Social Development, I mean, they are funding some of the counsellors at the CAP centres, which is the counselling access points that we have at schools and at the police stations, etc.
For schools that we work with, that's a very dynamic partnership that we have there. With the clinic, with the police station itself, we have signed up the social infrastructure, the churches, etc. So we have built quite a strong partnership in Helenvale itself with various stakeholders.
Partnerships or collaborations, they're actually hard work. They don't happen by themselves. You think you invite somebody to a meeting that they automatically would just come and just participate. So there's a lot of lobbying, there's a lot of leg work, there's a lot of trade-offs. So what benefits are there, what exchanges are there, how do you put a puzzle together where 1 + 1 doesn't give you 2, it gives you 5, you know. So if you can convince the Minister of Education or Arts and Culture, etc., that this is something that can help them in the delivery of their programs, then you know, the responses are generally very positive, and we've had some lasting impact from that.
It's footwork, you know. It's meeting people, asking people for meetings, visiting them at their houses. So it's trying to open that up and bring everybody into one space. You can have one ward where the ward councillor is very lax and he gives you kind of a carte blanche, do as you please, interact with the people. And you can go to another ward where a councillor is that everything must come through me. You start with me first. You can get in one ward you have where the main stakeholder is the ward committee, and in another one the dominant stakeholder is an SMME group. So it changed. So you have to adapt your strategy in terms of the conditions that prevail. And as a social facilitator, you need to be able to adapt to the conditions that prevail in that particular area.
People approach us now to say, but we want to work with you because of that. Because we feel heard, we feel accommodated, and there's a responsiveness and so forth. We as an organization are quite reflective at this point to say that we have been known as a building company. We build stuff. Nice things, but does it make a difference? And the honest answer is maybe, but not always, and certainly not in the ways that matter. Yeah. So I feel like, you know, the experience that we have in Helenvale has really added to our skill set and to our knowledge base. And that, you know, if you can do this in Helenvale, then you can really do this anywhere.
Thank you for joining us. For those of you who have joined as we've been playing the video, you'll have just seen the video presenting one of the social challenges and indeed some of the issues that we'll be discussing in terms of challenges that have existed always prior to COVID, and how communities and government have tried to address those challenges. We now move into the actual panel discussion of the session, and some housekeeping to start off with first. If you can put your questions in the Q&A that you'll see in the bottom of the chat. We very much encourage participation from those of you who are listening in from around the country and around the world, and to please enter those questions in the chat. And if you have any technical questions, please direct those to the host only. And I'm one of the hosts as well as Yasmin. So starting off with our panel, and also by way of explanation, I'm sitting in a bit of darkness here. We're experiencing load shedding, by which we have scheduled power cuts here in Johannesburg. So hence, that's why you can't see me very clearly. And it's also possible my connection may be a bit unstable, but hopefully we'll be able to make it through the session with no problems. Starting first and in alphabetical order, I'll go over to you, Andrew, and ask you if you can introduce your organization, the role it's played both prior to the pandemic, and some of your experiences in dealing with food security issues during the pandemic and since. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Danga, and good morning to my fellow panelists. Rashik, Satna, it's nice to see you all there, and hi to the audience. Danga, you know, I can bang on about governance issues. They're so important for how our towns and cities and society is governed. So please stop me. I'd like to start off with a true story. from last year during the height of the pandemic crisis. So municipality that we were working with correctly decided they were going to allocate 25 million towards food relief via civil society organizations to be distributed via the community kitchens. And there was a network of several hundred community kitchens that had sprung up. And so they called for proposals. And we first stressed that this project was being administered by some really committed and dedicated municipal officials. So that's not where the problem was. So firstly, what happened? Legal department said, is food a municipal mandate? It's not really our function. We have to kind of get a legal opinion on that. Then finance said, this is potentially fruitless and wasteful expenditure. If it's not our legislative mandate, we'll have to check this. And then the councillors got involved and said, well, we want equal distribution of food aid through all the wards, whether there's need or not, because that's fair. Okay, so you can't target where the most vulnerable and disadvantaged areas. And then they were using the grant and aid, municipal grant and aid rules, which requires civil society organizations, certainly in this part of the neck of the woods, to have 17 different documents submitted. So over 140 NGOs wanted to get involved in the scheme. 16 ended up meeting the requirements. So what's the results of this story? Well, the food aid, the 25 million Rand food aid started flowing to communities 6 months after the call for proposals, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of emergency food aid during the height of a crisis. So I want to come back to these points, but let me start off by saying, I think one of the biggest lessons that we learned, if I looked at how we all collectively responded to COVID during the course of last year and this year, communities that were well connected with themselves, with each other, and had some kind of connection into the municipality, some relationships of trust, they were able to thrive. And communities that weren't internally connected, didn't connect with neighboring communities, and had no trusted relationships with the municipality really struggled. So I guess what the overall point I'm trying to make here is that when we look at governance, relationships matter. Governance is not about the rules that government follows. It's about building relationships between the different sectors of society. So a bit about my organization. I work for the EDP, the Economic Development Partnership, and we deliberately occupy that in-between space. In other words, we between government, community, business, and academic and research initiatives. We are what we'd call we do sort of collaborative intermediation work in areas and around sort of themes around water systems, energy, waste, local economic development, and things like that. It's all about trying to help the different partners work together to do things differently to achieve better development outcomes at the end of the day. Because let's face it, our development outcomes are far from good in this country. So last year, like most parts of the country, we hit a crisis around food with the lockdown and with the pandemic. And so in April last year, we set up a Western Cape Food Forum to coordinate the distribution of food aid within civil society and between civil society and government. And just to say, we used this slogan, very simple slogan, which we had learned 3 years previously in responding to the drought crisis in the Western Cape. It was connect, communicate, collaborate, 3 C's. And we worked with 3 levels of CSOs, civil society organizations, the big food NPOs, the intermediary networks, and then the grassroots networks. Plus we brought in government. And the Western Cape government had organized themselves into a sort of humanitarian cluster, which brought together 8 different provincial government departments and the municipalities. So all well and good. In the first 4 months of the crisis, civil society provided 5.2 million, what we call food days of relief. I would estimate that's about 60% of the total food aid provided in our region, government providing the other 40%. And so what that demonstrated is that civil society in a crisis is able to respond and mobilize in a very quick, flexible, adaptive, micro detail way far quicker than government, and did a fantastic job. And government was quite surprised to the extent to which civil society could contribute. And that was the first lesson, that actually civil society are not just a bunch of oppositional gatekeepers to government. They can work with government to address serious issues in society. And if we can do it during a COVID crisis, why can't we do it post-COVID as we sort of recover and redevelop? So just to say, after the immediate kind of crisis, the food crisis had passed, building on the relationships of trust that had developed during the crisis, we started shifting this food forum from food aid to food and nutrition security. In other words, a more longer-term systemic focus, because food aid is not sustainable. We are promoting local production for local consumption, bringing in new partners like small farmers and informal traders. So it's taking it beyond civil society and government. And it's had quite an interesting influence on the Western Cape government, setting up what it calls the Nourish to Flourish program, looking at food and nutritional outcomes, despite the fact that provincial government doesn't have a clear and explicit mandate on food and food systems, other than agricultural production, perhaps. And a very new way of doing things has emerged. It's not government saying, well, we'll set up our programs and come and do our thing in your areas. The approach of government has been what's happening on the ground and how do we set up a more supportive and enabling environment to assist what we would call bottom-up mobilizing efforts from civil society, from entrepreneurs, from businesses, from households, from citizens. So it's not government competing with citizens, it's government enabling citizens to deliver what they would like to deliver in partnership with government. So a couple of governance lessons here I just draw out, Danga, from the story. The first one, the relationship between what we would call the bottom-up mobilizing environment and the top-down authorizing environment matters. It's not either or, it's both and. Both of these environments have strengths and they have weaknesses or limitations. Both need each other, but generally don't know how to engage. And so there is a value of having kind of neutral intermediaries in building two-way relationships of mutual accountability and trust. It doesn't necessarily happen of its own accord. One sometimes has to intervene to deliberately build these relationships of cooperation and structure the partnerships. Secondly, what also became apparent from my first story, you've got to address the culture and capabilities within government, within the top-down authorizing environment, if you want successful and effective whole of society approaches. Now, it's real partnerships and not just token kind of conversations. And at the moment, I would say, in our experience, unfortunately, the public sector in South Africa generally is not fit for purpose in this regard, with some notable exceptions. We kind of don't have a capable or developmental state, and it's really struggles, government from top to bottom, to establish those relationships of trust with the non-state actors and non-state sectors. So my concerns here, and zooming into the authorizing environment, I've got three concerns, and there's three consequences of these concerns. One is we see often unfortunately, quite a poor politics, a command and control approach amongst the political leadership, very threatened by non-state initiatives, wanting to do it all themselves as government. Secondly, rigid hierarchies from DGs down to assistant directors and from city managers down to operational employees, positions, titles, very, very important. And then thirdly, this huge bone of contention around regulatory compliance, a total slowdown in decision-making and very little focus on complex strategic issues. Why? Because people are overwhelmed with identifying material and non-material compliance issues. And consequence management and recoverability, and avoiding deviations because you've got to stick to the plan, and sort of stay in your lane mandatism, and fruitless and wasteful expenditure accusation. And a lot of these, unfortunately, in our experience, have become weaponized within the administrations. So you get malicious compliance, and if officials almost taking each other out, or councillors almost taking each other out on tripping up over the procedural issues, totally losing sight of service delivery and totally losing sight of the outside world. It's become a bubble situation. So the consequences of this is that many administrations that we work with tend to operate only inwards and upwards facing, upwards to politicians and upwards to the Auditor General, not downwards and outwards to communities. So that stops your ability to form relationships of trust with non-state actors. I would classify the kind of approach to governance is governance for government, not for better service delivery or for doing development differently or better development outcomes. And thirdly, and most importantly, government has struggled now to transact with non-state actors because of all the rules, and particularly with informality. There's a huge gap between where the resources of the public sector need to go and the institutions that are there that are all informal and cannot transact with government lawfully. So just in passing, and this is my final 2 points now, Danga, I think that the soon-to-be-launched Social Employment Fund is a very interesting and bold experiment from national government in this regard. It's going to run through the Industrial Development Corporation. And it's an experiment on how do you channel 800 million rand to 50,000 participants, in other words, people working for public benefit or social good, via civil society. And particularly the role of larger, more formal civil society organizations that can contract with the state, but also them being in partnership with the informal and the micro and the small activities on the ground. And that's sort of necessary bridge building between the over-formalization of the state and the informality of many communities and initiatives in the communities. So as I said, that's I believe going to be launched next week, and that's going to be a very interesting experiment. So my final lesson is around adaptive programming and delivery. I mean, if I look back at the Food Forum, we didn't start with a plan. We didn't start with a program. We just found willing partners and stepped into action. And I think that the Helenvale documentary that you showed, the one quote from the one organizer there, she said, "You can talk on a moving bus. Don't talk before the bus stops. Get on that moving bus, take action, and then talk while you're taking action." And I very like that quote there. What we did is we create space for learning and reflection, and then adapted and adjusted on a regular basis, almost on a bi-monthly basis. We changed what we were doing based on intelligence back from the system. And my experience of government planning is the opposite here. Kind of no action takes place unless there's an approved plan. It's got to have a diagnostic, it's got to have a theory of change, it's got to have an outcome and results framework, it's got to have indicators, and that takes months, if not years, to develop. And it's got to be linked to approved budgets, and that's another whole process, and linked to annual performance plan and IDPs and things like that. So again, my conclusion, good governance is about good relationships between different societal sectors and within government. In other words, a whole of government and a whole of society approach. It's got nothing to do with the rules of government, which should not, and clean audits and things like that. And to connect bottom-up mobilizing environment with the top-down authorizing environment, we need to seriously overhaul public sector capabilities and institutional culture around planning, programming, decision-making, and building relationships with the rest of society. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for those insights. And I think your experiences have really, by that breadth of the observations that you're able to provide us, that's really provided us this great platform to get into the session. I'd like to reach out to the other panelist who also has extensive experience within the local government sphere. Soups, if you could come in, and I think much like Andrew, perhaps introduce your perspective on and some of the work that you've been doing. I know that you've been working with also similar initiatives within communities as to what we saw in the Helenvale video, some harm reduction programs, but also perhaps your perspectives on what Andrew was had alluded to in terms of just the way in which government works, and then how that then contrasts with the way in which informality or the rest of the world, which is supposed to be governed by government, actually works. Over to you, Soups.
Thanks, Danga, and morning panelists and participants and everyone that's on the call. Thanks for the opportunity. So, I mean, just to start off, it's like your head is all like in the cloud on some of the stuff, but I work for local government, and I think maybe it would just be useful to say that what I say doesn't necessarily going to be the views shared by local government, because I take a very honest and critical view of that. There have been some like interesting lessons that have happened in the last 18 months or so. And I think that has been, the theme that started off this morning with the Urban Fest is really about, we've been in this crisis for a long time. COVID just like pulled the plug, took out the water and showed us all the rocks in the bed, So, it then begs the question, what more you need? And I really share the sentiments, and I have similar examples. Okay, so all right, seems like it was muted. So I'm not sure exactly where I got muted, but just then a very good morning to everyone, and thanks for the opportunity. I was saying that I come from local government, but I don't necessarily have the city doesn't necessarily share my views, and I share the city's views. So, just work with me a little bit on that, because I try and be more inside as well as critical about what we're doing. I share a lot of the sentiments and the feelings that Andrew has spoken about. And it's like I said, the theme of this morning's fest was like, really, COVID is just something that really made the urgency of the crisis more pronounced than what it was. And the real question is, how many more crises are we gonna have to weather? How many more signs we're gonna have to, deal with? How many more symptoms and causes before we start shifting and changing? And I think that's pretty much linked into how the municipality and local government, and whilst I'm focusing on local government, it is a sphere of government, it's closest to people. It can and it should make a difference. And I think if you really think about it, everybody really appreciates good governance, especially at a local level. And if you get that right, I think you unleash so many potentials and so many livelihoods and opportunities. Having said that, I think in my experience, I come from a planning background. I'm working in an inner city development context. There's been a number of valuable lessons. And a starting point is that I think these lessons are there, but we're not as an organization, and maybe I speak for eThekwini, but perhaps I can speak for other cities and governments. We're not a learning organization. We may, and I've been one of the partners in creating a learning institute of development. We have webinars, we have National Treasury with city support programs, all of that. But how do you get into and underneath that and start using those lessons to change? So partly is, and part of the problem is, and when you deal with governance, you need to accept that you need to venture into something learning. Make yourself vulnerable, open it out. And governance is about sharing. It does not mean you take away the mandate to govern. What it means is you prioritize on what you're governing on. You know if it's making an impact. And I think sometimes we get so crowded with the notion that public participation is just consultation. And the way we deal with communities and business and other stakeholders, it's really about how we communicate that, and thinking we need to keep control of how we govern. There's always going to be a need for local government. But if you enrich it and you diversify it and make it more relevant, that's a whole different ballgame. So one of the issues is, I think, as we're not a learning city and municipalities are not learning organizations. So it's like turning the Titanic when you're about to hit the iceberg, or if you already hit it, but you still don't know how to turn it, you know, or how to save your people or save your population, whatever analogy you want to use. So essentially, there was a number of things that struck me. So, as an example is that there were some smaller things we did that made some changes, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on the homelessness and working with people with drugs and harm reduction, etc. But something around meetings, I think we've tweaked with some systems, and some systems are there to stay. So that's the innovation. So online meetings, being more online, having less delayed meetings, taking away the complaints about the food is not good, or it's not this type of food, all that catering issues, all of that is like, it's like water under the bridge. And I think that's refreshing. We've also made it a lot more accessible, like when you're in dealing with like your council meetings, how the public and community can gain access. We've just taken this machinery and made it slightly more slimline and swifter. Like I know when we do agendas, you can spend like 2 weeks just preparing, printing agendas, wasting paper, delivering it, etc. That all has come out of the system. I think we've done well on some of the employment wellness side. We've broadened our spectrums on that. We've dealt with issues around mental illness, psychological services, something that it's very shied away from a very rigid, male-dominated local government setting. I think we've less successfully managed some of the work from home, remote kind of issues. I think on the professional side, that's pretty much, it's developing. Excuse me for a moment. But I think on the on the actual staff on the field, I think we're struggling. So we've moved with rotational issues. People coming in for 3 days, going off for 2 days. I don't know what's happening here, Dunga. And what has that actually meant is I think it's been more of a disruption of services. So there's other more innovative ways to deal with it. Like we need to really think our shift systems. We need to rethink our relationships with trade unions and bargaining council. And what does that mean if we're going to shift and make a city resilient in the times of a pandemic, and just to make it better functioning on an ordinary day, which I think I see no difference between the crisis and where we are. I think we've been in crisis for a long time. I think around the finances, there's been some specific issues, and we really need to take a good deep dive, not only as a municipality, but as a country. Is this the way you're going to finance cities, etc.? So coming to some of the examples very quickly, working on the homeless side of things and with issues around drug rehabilitation, etc., harm reduction. The city has tried this for, like, I think the CSIR in 2016 said we had like close to 6,500 homeless people living in and around the inner city, mostly, maybe some other urban nodes, etc. A lot of it is got a sort of like rough sleeping in shelters, outside on pavements, etc. We've taken, like, I've sat in those meetings, we've taken like extraordinary amounts of time, like 2 years, to try and get some examples working, to try and demonstrate there's an urgency and there's a willingness from the city to engage. Partly was the harassment from our security services, blurred lines between security and UIPs, private securities, etc. Those also play into what type of city you create and how you allow for inclusiveness. Came the crisis. What I'm saying is because we were working with NGOs and we had and sometimes, you don't want to make everything reside on one person, but there's also something to be said about the power of agency and a very good deputy mayor at the time that really wanted to get out of the comfort space of just taking no answers. Like it's not our mandate. We have unfunded mandates. We can't be working with NGOs because they don't have this type of documentation or track records, etc. So there we had an agency person. That person really took us into a new ball game on that. But when the announcement was made, I think we already been joining up and communicating and building relationships. Even though our actions have been, joint actions have been slower, when it happened, firstly, we were faced with a situation that we had to trust, and we relied on NGOs, and they spent most of their resources and their times in feeding people. The city did procure some resources at an extraordinary amount of money, like in terms of marquees, mattresses, personal packs, even some of the food. But the lessons there was the nature of relationships, especially at a time of a crisis. And if you've had some pre-knowledge and, like I know people by name and others know me, and likewise for other city officials, you can get by. So we are already prepared for that. So we were better. So preparedness and networking is important. The importance of the political is important, as well as the administration. In this case, that political person really like kind of put people in line. And sometimes you don't want that because you also a thinking professional and you don't want to do that. But in some ways, she stepped out of that and said, this is what we need to be doing. Heaven below is just, as the politics changed, I mean, the very same officials, and this I think is what Andrew mentions, and I think we often speak about the politics, and I'm not saying it's not there, but the way the practitioners, the administration can slow things down. They're now re-questioning, is it our mandate? Unfunded mandates. Did the project have authority? We need to go back for authority. And it's really like, you see how officials play political games as much as you expect politicians to be playing political games, but we're in that mix as well. I think the nature of like working with universities, business, NGOs, the homeless people themselves has been a remarkable opportunity, and one of probably my most rewarding years or months in a 28-year local government career. And I think, what one appreciates is, yes, as a government, there are issues around risk. That doesn't mean throw the baby out with the bathwater, but also relax on some of those things if it doesn't matter. So because I come from a planning background, I could like help on trying to access sites. So you can, temporary installment of or erection of marquees, creation of food gardens. All of this are still there, but it's like when you go to a planner, they're like, first thing, where's the zoning? Or if you want to put something on a park, is it public open space? Now you need an EIA. Like, how do you deal with quick interventions? And I think as a practitioner movement, we need to get there, and maybe later on some of that will come through. And then lastly, just one more point around the harm reduction. I think most cities are quite conservative, and especially in eThekwini. And eThekwini has its history and all its issues that speaks for itself, as much as it's a beautiful city and an interesting place. The issue, or rather the response of actually supporting people that take drugs is like a non-heard issue. So you get like all this conservatism, this, comes some kind of religious moral compasses that come through. So we started a needle substitute or program, and that got like stopped in its tracks because it was seen like you're actually helping drug addicts to inject.
Thank you, Subs. I think I would just like to interject just there, because I think it would be good to pull in some comment from the audience as well as before I also bring in my other panelists. So there's an interesting comment here which says, I think better urban governance should positively affect residents' ability to access local government and engage in decision-making, thereby influencing local government accountability and response to citizen demands. And I think both your comments and Andrew's were very much, I think, perspectives, both of you, about the all of society approach, which we speak of, which is that in the South African vision of developmental local government, that citizens and the whole of society should be involved in and should be given the agency, should be capacitated, enabled to engage with government on the things that matter to their lives. And on that point, I'd like to bring in Duduzi just to speak to the perspective from another sphere of government. Because part of the vision of developmental local government is also the whole of government approach, and which in the South African context is understood to mean that the provincial and the national spheres should work with the local spheres to assist in achieving developmental local government. Duduzi, are you there?
Thank you very much. I am here, and thanks to the panel, and thank you for inviting us. I just wanted to speak to a slide so that I don't waste a lot of time. One of the things about us in the Gauteng city region is that we're organized around 5 cities, which contribute uniquely to the economy of Gauteng in the country. One of the things we did in appreciation of the impact of COVID-19, because I think what you've asked us to do is to demonstrate our appreciation of the impact of COVID on the Gauteng city region, which, as I'm saying, it's organized around the 5 districts, or 3 metros and the 2 districts. But also because I think one of the significant impact of COVID-19 was that it really changed the way we were organized. It changed the way we were governed. In fact, from where we were sitting, we think that what COVID-19 did created unprecedented ways of how, as government or as the city region, we should be responding to the problems that were existing even pre-COVID, and those are socio-economic exclusions that from where we're sitting require attention. But we also think that COVID-19 has really created opportunity for us to rethink how we must respond to urbanization, including a sense of what is our urbanism. I mean, and what I mean by that is the way we think urbanization has been spoken about, what has been its effect and its impact on the spatial transformation of the Gauteng city region. So I think there's a need to really look into those issues, but also just the role of cities on the economy and the role of cities on the health of its residents. I think it's something that came very sharply during this process. And we also think that going forward, cities have got to, on an ongoing basis, invest in data, science, policy, planning, in order to make sure that cities do become centers of socio-economic development, but also in the context of the latest UN Habitat, cities must be able to really play a meaningful role in the economy. So we thought one of the things we should always do is that before we even thought of organizing ourselves, responding to the pandemic, just took the work that we did with the Gauteng City Region Observatory, primarily because we thought data research will help us develop a response to the pandemic by understanding the environment, and that environment related to issues of crowded living conditions, access to public health facilities, limited access to communication tools, reliance on public transport. Some of the things that I think the colleagues are speaking to, because we were saying this is a novel pandemic, but if we're to respond to it effectively, we've got to continuously understand the fabric of the people that we are leading as a Gauteng city region in our 5 cities. We've been Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni, Tshwane, Sedibeng, and indeed the Vaal. But also we thought, secondly, we just look at the vulnerability of people with regards to the impact of the pandemic. And that meant, for example, there are many of our people who are unemployed. So if we are to develop responses, we've got to know who are these people and where are they, and what is it that we needed to do to make sure that on an ongoing basis we respond to them. For us, it meant adopting agile governance structures that were responsive to the pandemic, Danga. And what we mean by agile structures, we had to think of a 6-pillar strategy that says, for example, firstly, comprehensive health response. And what we meant by that was that as we were doing ongoing response to issues of health, what is it that we needed to do to better pull everybody, one resource into one unit and respond collect. And that meant establishing what we call a Director General, HODs in one room, city managers in one room. Why we were doing that was because we wanted to avoid long decision-making processes, because in the context of the Disaster Management Act, it was quite clear to us that you needed to take decisions and take them quickly. So the notion of emergency meant establishing agile structure, decision-making systems, but also supported by evidence and research, and that was another important aspect. The issue of law enforcement and compliance was significant for us, so that as we were going into the different levels of lockdown as announced by the president, we needed to enforce non-pharmaceutical interventions, working with all the law enforcement agencies in the province, but also bringing in national. I think there's an issue that relates to food security and social relief. It needed partnership. I mean, we brought in the NGOs, probably what Andrew was raising, because without NGOs that have been in the system, understanding the impact of working with families that are vulnerable, as the state alone, we were not going to be in a position to respond to that. And that helped us a lot, because we're able to serve about more than 2 million or so people that needed help during the lockdown, but also invested in the correct data to understand as to where are these people and what kind of assistance they needed. And when the social relief decision came from national, it became very easy to be able to support, including establishment of shelters for people who are homeless in the various cities. I must indicate that social mobilization and human solidarity was important. What we meant by that was the issue of partnering with the private sector, but also partnering with NPOs, as I'm indicating, working with political parties in the legislature, working with civil society organizations, so that the message carried through about the response can also resonate with the people. Yes, there were weaknesses that were raised, especially if you go to our case study report that was done by GTEC and also the UNDP. You would be able to pick up some of the challenges that related to governance weaknesses, despite the fact that our governance model in response to the pandemic was quite useful. The issue of state capacity and capability was very, very important, that as you are managing the response to the pandemic, you needed to make sure that the state functions. The state is continuously responding to the ongoing problems of people, but you needed then to say, you need a different type of state, probably the issues that Monsani and Andrew are raising. And that meant really making sure that it's the way we function and respond to our program, and developing a recovery response, which is the last point about the economic response. We had to then say to ourselves, with our plan of growing Gauteng together, we needed to remodel it because of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, so that our economic recovery is based on the fact that we are responding to what would have been the actual impact, what kind of interventions in terms of unemployment we need to put in place, what kind of interventions in terms of poverty, inequality, and so forth and so on we needed to put in place. So this operating model really assisted us to be more focused, to be as adaptive as possible. But we also think that going forward, we need to carry this for going forward. And one of the things that we're raising is that research data are the biggest investment that cities, and I think city region have got to pull in place, because one thing we did was to do a partnership now with the universities, because we're home to universities, and establish what we call the GP coronavirus platform and data management. This platform really assisted us to be able to know what is the movement of the pandemic, in which ward, because that's how the granularity of the intervention was. And remember, as I was saying earlier, it looked at issues of vulnerability, it looked at issues of poverty and so forth and so on, so that even when we are now implementing the response towards the challenge on the vaccine rollout, this model will remain a framework in how we are responding, but also knowing where the interventions have got to be. So in a way, COVID-19 has really helped us to really think of ourselves as one unit, albeit different cities, albeit the fact that cities have got their own in terms of legislation or spheres of government, but we continue to look at ourselves as one entity called the Gauteng City Region, and we think going forward, we need to invest in sustainable interventions so that we can address the ongoing challenges that we have also learned during this process in response to the pandemic, but in a more sustainable way, so that indeed the cities do become the future response, they become centers where we are able to respond to challenges of the economy and so forth and so on. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Duduzi, for those comments and that perspective from the provincial sphere, and indeed the efforts that were made in the Gauteng City region, where for those of us participants who are joining from outside South Africa, the three big metros of city of Joburg, city of Tshwane, and Ekurhuleni are very key nodes. I'd like to pick up on some of those things that you had mentioned later, particularly in terms of the relationships between spheres of government. But at this stage, also to remind our participants that there's a very busy conversation going on both in the chat and the Q&A box. We will be getting to some of those as well, but you can see some of the responses and questions that are coming in from the participants and responses from the panelists. But I'd like to now bring in a perspective from our colleague from Kenya, Rapudo. Welcome. And having heard, the perspectives here from the local government sphere as well as the provincial sphere in terms of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the governance issues that were spotlighted by that epidemic, as well as systemic, perhaps government issues that had been existing before. And also as another African country that also has a degree of devolution that is not typical across the continent. Perhaps could you introduce your organization and what in fact you're doing? And I think if you would bias your remarks towards the all of society approach. So in terms of thinking about the broader network, civil society that you're engaging with. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Danga. I believe you can hear me clearly?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Greetings to all the people of South Africa, and receive greetings from Kenyan people, because we share a heritage. We came up with Arambe, which means pulling people together, and you have Ubuntu. So Ubuntu and Arambe are very important things, and that's what bring South Africans and Kenyans and Africans together, because that is the spirit of pulling together, because you're saying that why we need to pull our resources together, we need to pull our people together, we need to put our people thinking into one kind of a direction, but have varied thoughts that we believe that is going to. My name is Rapudo Hawi, so that to make it on brief, I work for an organization called Kijiji Yetu, which means our village. And our village is a concept that has been built for a long time, which has been, we're trying to look at where is the village. It's in our mind, it's in our family, it's within our people, it's within the people who have been affected with the pandemic. And you remember when you could see a lot of things happening in the screen, where we could see people in China dropping in hospitals. You could see people in Italy throwing their money, the euros. And this was kind of a tragedy to all African people, because we were in despair. We felt a sense of hopelessness, where you could see people now giving up, people walking the street crying very hard. And the spirit of Ubuntu and the spirit of Arambe was very instrumental in this process, because there are people outside there who did not give up. And this is very important, because I have to tell you about the Kenyan story, and that's why I've joined this. And I have to thank the team that has brought me here, including Danga. So just to go to the issues now, in Kenya, we have devolution. And devolution is a structure that is clearly founded based on the people who are saying that they wanted their people the government to devolve services and to devolve also human capital. And we had towns, we had provinces, we had even the national government. But this one was changed into one national government and 47 county governments. So in Kenya, we have 47 county governments, which decentralized from the eight provincial governments. So we have, like in Nairobi, which is a city, it's a county government, which means it's governed by a governor who is elected by the people, and also we have the members of county assembly who are elected at the ward level. So it's important to understand this, because this also plays a lot of role in governance and how resources are shared within the local level. And this was very instrumental, because during that time, the county governments, given that they have budgets that were allocated, they didn't have any budgets that were clearly allocated to issues of disaster management and health issues. So we didn't know if COVID was a health issue, if it was a disaster issue. So this became a very important, very big challenge for the government. And that's why they were able to come up with a unit. So we could be able to see the Ministry of Health trying to work out on ways of how they can count. The security team also is trying to work out on its way of doing this. But very importantly to the county governments, because that's where urban governance is centered on. Within the county governments, we have what is called a county integrated development plan, which is developed every 5 years by county governments, which is given that health now has been decentralized in Kenya, where the county governments is given allocation. Despite saying that, it's still only 20% of the national revenue. So which means there's limited allocation. So this affected during the COVID-19, because there was no preparedness in terms of how do we deal with this kind of, because at that time we found also doctors had gone on strike. At the same time, nurses had gone on strike because they are demanding for better services, and they're demanding to be taken back to the national government. So the county governments, given that it's run by politicians and they don't have experts, and it becomes a very big challenge on what they could do. So the national government was able to put a COVID-19 emergency response strategy, which they were able to see on how to deal with this. So as they were able to do this, because there was no allocation of revenue, and that time, because the COVID came in, it took government a lot of time to put a plan in place. And even there was no clear coordination between the 47 governors and the presidency, because they have a summit which always meets every now and then. So what happens, because civil society organizations and grassroots organizations have to take care of their people. We have people who have lost their jobs. We have people who have been who cannot pay rent because they cannot. They have children also who could not go to school because they could not have money, and they could also, the issue of curfew was also a very big issue, because the issue of fear, saying that now how do we protect ourselves from COVID-19? The issue of awareness was also very low, because people were believing that this is a myth, this is not a disease. So that's something that also affected the response towards COVID-19. Just to also give an example of one of the cities within the ocean of Mombasa, where we had people who were trying to cross from the mainland to the island. So we have Mombasa mainland, and also we have Mombasa Island. And there's a ferry which crosses every now and then. And that ferry carries over 2,000 people, which is not the capacity. The capacity is supposed to carry almost around 400 people. So what happened is that during the COVID-19, it stalled, and there's commotion, and people were like, during the trips, they only had 2 trips during the day. So there were a lot of fights, there were a lot of violence, there were a lot of, even people lost their lives. So civil society organizations had to go and organize. What we did was to, as KGGA, we were able to link with Ushahidi, which is a platform for mapping. So we're able to map out and see what the government has been able to do. What have they been able to do in terms of food supply? What have they been able to do in terms of water? Are there water points so that we could be able to go to the county governments? Like when we came up with the issue of water, we realized that informal settlements, like the ones back in Nairobi, in Kibera, in Mathare, in Kawangware, and many other places, these areas did not have water points. So we had to go to the county governments and ask, are you able to provide water points for people? Because this was very important and instrumental. Another issue was the issue of food in terms of food supplies. You find that government used to give out foods, but you see the people who are used are the village elders. So you find that village elders and the chief. So the roles of the members of the county assembly was not very clear, because we have two systems of governance where the national government works with the chief at the lowest level. So we have the chief, the county commissioners, like that. And then the county governments, you have the governor, and then you have the lower level of the village admin and the ward admin. So you see that what people believe in, they believe so much in the national government structure, which became also a very big issue in this. So what you're saying is that we had also to come up with a digital platform where we could send SMS to people and alerts of what is happening. And also we partnered with one of the organizations called Usalama Forum on an issue of security, which we were able to do a survey on the issue of the private security, the people who were guarding residence infrastructure, critical infrastructures, because we realized that there was no information about some of them, and even some of them had lost their jobs. Some of them had even committed suicide. So this became very instrumental, because we find that many of them are coming from informal settlements, and this was able to bring in the issue, rise of crime. So what initially I'm saying is that, so that we move to the next, is that the three things that we were able to. One is you're able to build effective community networks, because who is the person who's giving information? How do they liaise and make sure that the legislator knows what is happening on the ground? Like once we are able to, like for us as KGGA, once we're able to get the information from the mapping, we're able to do memos, and we're able to do also emails to these legislators and go and meet with them. And also attend some of the meetings, the emergency response meetings, so that we can influence. Another issue is also invest in digital transformation tools. What are the digital transformation tools? Like, do we know what is going on? And I've seen a lot has been explained in this channel, and I thank you for showing us the video. And I think for Kenya, we'll pick up some of the things. But the digital transformation tool, does it respond, or is it adaptable to the user? Because in Kenya, I know almost around 60%, it's still at 48 to 38% of people do not have smartphones. So that's a very big issue. So, and these are the people that we're trying to target. And then the last point, you're looking at conversation. What is the conversation you're having here? Is it a conversation of the elite? Is it a conversation of the poor? Because for the poor is about how am I getting food on my table? What ways can make me? Criminality has gone high, given that the pandemic has, because most of the trade that happens in Kenya, almost around 60 to 7% happens at night. If you're traveling at night. If you're trading, you're taking your goods from one place to another, you're taking them at night, because that's the time that there's low traffic. So those are very important things. And now that the president of Kenya has also released, brought down the curfew, I believe now maybe the trade will go. So I'm here to learn, I'm here to connect, and I'm also here to tell you that South Africa is a best case. And we are here to share information, and we are here to learn from one another. And if you have time to visit Kenya, please come.
Thank you, Rapudo. I think you should not speak that too loud. We may take you up on your offer sooner than you expect to visit Kenya. Thank you for those insights, and I really would like to pick up on a few things that you were mentioned and share them, and perhaps get insights from comment rather from some of the other panelists. We'd heard earlier from Andrew and Subs about the importance of relationships and particularly within government, between government and other members of society. And then we've also heard now from Rapudo and then Duduzi about the technology, and particularly in this case of a public health emergency, how important it was to keep track of the spread of the disease here in the case of South Africa, but also it sounds as if in Kenya also just actually what interventions were coming in from the different levels of government in terms of responding to the pandemic and providing information. I was wondering if those two things can meet in a successful way, and perhaps start with you, Andrew. I mean, within your food security network and moving forward, was there any role of technology? Do you see a role of technology in similar sort of initiatives in terms of bridging that information gap from those from the haves and to the majority of society who perhaps do not have as easy access to information?
Okay, yes, I talk about the role of appropriate technology, because sometimes we feel kind of these smart city solutions are the answers, and often they're not. If you're using very basic technology, I mean, I'm thinking of what we were able to do in getting digital vouchers to community kitchens using a very simple WhatsApp method of communication. That worked very well, because the assumptions that we make is that people have smartphones, or that they can log on, or they have data, and these assumptions are often not real. And we did find one of the consequences of social distancing, or not meeting face-to-face, was exclusion of many poor and marginalized communities during COVID, because they just didn't have the data to log on. They couldn't get their cell phones to connect. They were using non-smart cell phones, and they really struggled. So a group like the Community Action Networks actually had a budget for data for communities to participate as much as they can, and certainly through the Food Forum and the Food Community of Practice that operates out of the UWC. Also, how do we make sure that there's always an accessible kind of low-tech platform for people to step into and participate and communicate with? And it doesn't have to be big budgets. It's just doing the basics with WhatsApp groups and basic data provision. So I would say it's a big issue for inclusion. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. And also, if I could bring you in, Subs, on that question as well. I was wondering if you had, in your experience and dealing perhaps with communities which are incredibly marginalized, as you mentioned with the harm reduction programs, in your view, are there innovative ways in which government can engage through technology with communities and sort of make that relationship with all of society stronger?
Yeah, on the experience I've had around the homeless program, much of it was run through WhatsApp groups. So the entire operations for 4 months, feeding, setting up shelters, access to ablutions, etc., all was run through a WhatsApp group. In addition to that, I think also from the municipal side, the more like mainstream systems changes. I mean, planning after many, many years is finally making that shift into an online system. Granted, some of it is still blended in a sense that you still need a hard copy, and you can do it online. That creates also some difficulties, and I think there is a fine balance between when you use a blended system and when you don't, because sometimes it like defeats the benefits you're trying to arrive at. I think the example on the planning one, and I think it ties into some of the questions that I saw some of the participants have been proposing, is as much as planning has the system, it's like they say old wine, new bottles. So you've not really changed the regulatory system. So you may have 1,000 or 100 special consents and you're still refusing them, or X number of building plans and still refusing them, and not for good reason. Many of these things can, and when I think the question is not to lose compliance, but to make compliance relevant and really think about the most prioritized issues around compliance, because otherwise you're just pushing paper and you're making more legality. People trying to be legal, you're making them more illegal. The other thing that we've also done, the last point to that is, we've also tried, and it's really testing it, is toying with the idea of a free inner city Wi-Fi service in different precincts. So we started off with Warwick, we moved to the beachfront, we now in the central CBD, and we also did something like in the tourist areas like that of Florida Road. So it's like 500 megabytes free. It will go up to a gig by the end of this year. But it's really just toying with the idea of how people feel about using their phones and accessing free data. And some of it is a nuisance about how you log in, etc. So those are some of the test case examples we still have to move through. Thanks, Tanga.
Thanks, Subs. I mean, yeah, you reminded me WhatsApp. I mean, it's become such a useful organizing tool for in so many cases. And I think we do have a tech specialist here in Rapuda. I want to put to you a question that's come through the chat here, which is actually to say, there's a question around connector metrics and diagnostic tools that can interlink academia or government and CSOs, NGOs, and the cohesion of a information research and advisory platform for all sectors. I wondered if you had any thoughts of that. And in fact, when you're saying South Africa's best practice, I think I might bat that back to you and say from platforms such as Ushahidi and so on. I mean, Kenya has led the way in many ways in terms of citizen engagement, accountability, transparency through technology. And could you speak perhaps to that experience and relate to this question from the chat?
I thank you so much, Danga, and I think most of the responses I've got from Andrew and Dr. Sobs, I think those are very good responses. One of the biggest issue here is adaptability, and you have to look at the revolution behind adaptability in Kenya. M-Pesa has become, which everybody know about, is the money, withdrawal of money and access of money. This has become something that now everybody can use to access the money, because you can use the money to do your business. You can use your money to engage, and this is what has driven tech. Sorry. This is what has taken, so this is what has taken tech companies to adapt into the issue of, we are talking about metrics here. We're talking about how is the connection in terms of, one of the biggest issues about, and I've heard about the issue of WhatsApp here. Most of the people we were engaging in, they were using WhatsApp. So the system that we are using for the one for Ushahidi, as an integrated system that as WhatsApp, it can integrate Facebook, it can introduce data from Twitter. So once we were able to interact, we were able to harvest data from this, because let's say like if you're tracking on issues of food supply, in, let's say like in different informal settlements, it was easier for us, because one of the biggest issues, like we're looking at some of the hashtags, some of the keywords that have been used there, so that we're able to harvest that and put it in a map. It's because you're able to now to be, because given that you're able to hack into the Twitter, you're able to hack into and also the WhatsApp, you're able to connect into WhatsApp. That became the second issue, is that the grassroots organizations that we are working with, we had to conduct a training in the initial stage for them to understand some of the low-tech systems that we use. Because one of the issues that we had to come up with the WhatsApp groups, we had to come up with WhatsApp platforms that are integrated to the system, which were uploaded then to the system. And also we had to adapt training for almost around 3 or 4 times. And then the last point where in this is that Kenya has also a big challenge of when you're talking about tech. Much of the things are copycat. So there's not originalities that we've also been able to see. So you also find that usability of some of the tools has become a big check. So it's something that is being developed with time. And this is where the civic tech is coming in, so that we can be able to bring the real people, the people that we're engaging in. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Rapudo. And just to let everyone in the session know, that glitch and the echo that you heard was in fact me trying to switch over, or rather my laptop about to lose power, and me having to switch over to my cell phone, which I've now done. As I mentioned earlier in the session, I have load shedding, so no electricity. So we'll keep trying to move on. And just to let you know that I'm also not able to see the chat very clearly, but I'll attempt to raise and bring up issues from there. I would just like to bring in Duduzi now to speak to, and from the South African context, some of those questions that were raised about the relationship between the different spheres of government, and perhaps how you might speak to the Disaster Management Act. So I've heard from some commentators, for example, that perhaps the relationship as envisioned in that act in terms of the response to disaster and the different spheres of government was that it was more nationally driven than perhaps the act envisaged. So perhaps more preponderance towards the national directives, number one. And then number two, also, could you comment on the fact that some people felt that the response based on that act has been a security-driven one, so things like lockdowns and curfews and that kind of thing, rather than perhaps some of the softer issues, some of the other issues around, well, not soft, but we've heard about food security, but that the focus was on security rather than necessarily welfare?
No, thank you very much. I think it's not a perception, it's real. When we all started, because we didn't understand what this pandemic is or its impact, the act really allowed for something of that nature, where the intervention was nationally driven, led by the president, the National Command Coronavirus Council, and to a very great extent, to enforce it. Then there was an introduction not only of the normal South African Police Service, but the additional army, so that the act is really implemented or enforced. But I think as we were learning from level one, sort of from the level one, level two, we did realize that in our structures, there is a need to deal with softer issues. And I think if you remember one of the things we raised, especially also what Andrew's raising about the people, how did we make sure that the people are brought into this response? Because you can't just be a government and you ignore the views of the people, you ignore the challenges that people are faced with on a daily basis. So that helped us to really bring about a shift in saying that it's not just about enforcement. In particular, it's not just about the local, it's not about law enforcement, it's about everybody else. And therefore, the whole thing of the district development councils being established, including the most important thing, Danga, was the issue of the ward-based war rooms. And the ward-based war room forced us to bring in people from the ground to actively participate in their responses. And that brought the element of the state, of the people, and really dealt with the myth that this is just a national response. So I think for us, we have learned a lot from that. And one of the things we've learned out of this implementation of the Disaster Management Act is that to a very great extent, we've got to capacitate cities with regards to responding to disasters holistically, because floods are biggest disasters we've come to be faced with, because of the infrastructure in cities is old, and therefore there's a need to put in a lot of money in that space. But I think the coordination, if you look at the current discussions of the district development model, one plan, one vision. So COVID-19 enforced that. It helps us to say we have to work together, but more importantly, bring in people in whatever we're doing. Just another 2 or 3 issues that one would like to also respond to. It's true that during COVID-19, because of the emergency procurement, corruption became a big issue. Those that were, it's like saying COVID came in, the COVID-19 pandemic came in, there were already other pandemics. And one of the pandemics we have to talk about is corruption. It was there, but in the context of Gauteng, we had introduced integrity systems, transparency in the procurement of services. But because of the disaster procurement services, some of those things were laxed. And then it cropped in. Those that are generally involved in corruption exacerbated that aspect. So we have to come back and infuse and institutionalize issues of integrity, and make sure that the procurement of services is transparent. And I agree with those who are saying we have to make sure that those that are in the civil sector can work with government or cities to really deal with corruption, because it eats from the people. It takes away really what we're supposed to deliver from the people. I think the last point is that cities going forward, other than the issues of data investment, investing in data and research and development, cities have got to be able to be given capacity to deliver on energy and water. So you can't always say, no, the water is a national thing, is a regional thing. For a city to be able to attract investments, for a city to be able to respond to daily challenges of people, you have to allow them to have a capacity to deliver on energy. So whether it's about the power purchasing agreement, the convention and changing of the current ESCOM laws, the conversation about the AIPPs, it must happen, because if you do not do that, cities will suffer, as we're suffering now, that we've got blackouts that are happening and cities don't know what to do. So we've got to support cities to be able to have energy security and water security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Duduzi. I think those are some very good comments that you're bringing up, and I think I would like to pick up on one of those, which is about the autonomy of cities. And I think Subs had also mentioned about the sustainability, financial sustainability of cities. We also heard earlier from Andrew about that there've been unfunded mandates, which have been an issue, particularly in the case of emergencies coming up. And I wonder if this is a discussion, I think, as you say, that we need to raise, because it seems to be a continuing one. So even the mandate of national for emergency funding, I think, affects then the lived experience of emergencies, which is indeed a local one. I don't know also if we could address the question that was coming up in the chat. I noticed that Ashraf Adam was engaging with Andrew, excuse me, on leadership. Because on the one hand, we've spoken about an all of society approach, we've spoken about a whole of government approach, and the question of leadership then in all sectors of society arises. But in this case, particularly from the government side, perhaps some observations from you, Subs, on the leadership question. I mean, is leadership something that we just talk about? How important really is it in that city context? And particularly with this perspective that I just introduced, which is about, we all live our lives local. Our lives are a local experience. And so then local leadership in many cases then becomes so important.
Thanks, Danga, for that. I'm a bit slow on unmuting, sorry. Look, I think there is an issue of leadership in cities. Politically, definitely. I think it's the nature of political systems we have, the caliber of local leadership. And I think, when you engage with political parties themselves, they'll also tell you those are the issues. In a sense that yes, we always hear this issue about politicians driving municipalities, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but to the extent where we've designed a system where the political engages in the policy, and in some ways they've shied away from being policy makers, and partly it's the experience and the capability to do that. And secondly, it's also the kind of interference or the crowding in the administration has in around that policy environment. So I think there's two parts or many parts to the story, but definitely a more able local leadership, especially around the political as well as around the administrative, can shift and change how a municipality works. And I may think, even if it's at a city manager level or the top 2 levels or 3 levels, all those are important. But I also think what's also we often forget in a municipality is how much we as technocrats and professionals, etc., that we still keep things the way they are, the same way. And we come from organizations where I come from a planning council aspect, or I'm a planner, or somebody's an engineer, etc. How much of that has not shifted and changed? We all think we're working in this perfect world, which we're not. And I think that's the issues that Andrew also mentioned about grappling with informality, etc. And it touches on the point that I think Ashraf and somebody else was having a discussion about Helenvale. It's about, how do I, as a planner or as an architect or as a municipality, to involve myself or my staff or whatever it is in issues around social issues, counseling, softer issues, as much as still doing the built environment work that you do. So I think, it's a variety of an approach on how you deal with leadership. And I think with good leadership, and we hear this now because we're around the corner from elections, multi-billion companies, that's what municipalities are. And you need to have your finger on the pulse, and you need to be able to take those decisions and gear up to be an organization that is responsive. And that cuts across on leadership. Thanks.
Thanks, Subs. I think those are definitely very, very pertinent points. And I see that, and speaking of elections, I mean, the irony is, I think, as for those people who live in Johannesburg will know, there's a comment in here about decentralized energy production and whether the ability of cities to procure more power will in fact prevent load shedding. And clearly that hasn't happened. It seems like it was more of an electoral ploy than has actually transpired. Well, we're left with about 15 minutes. And what I'd like to do then is to go through and ask each of the panelists, who we thank for having joined us and given us of this time today, to perhaps reflect on what they've heard today and make some closing remarks based on perhaps what they initially had thought coming into the session, but really addressing the question of what kind of innovations or what kind of changes in governance became apparent during the course of the pandemic, and perhaps prior to it, perhaps that were highlighted during the pandemic, that they think would be critically important or very important for us to focus on moving forward as we think of the resilience of our cities, as we think of their response to crises in general, but also this particular public health crisis that we're still experiencing. If I could start with you, Rapudo, perhaps you could come in and make some brief closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Danga. But before I go into the closing remark, you talked about leadership, and it's important also people to understand the Kenyan context. Because one of the biggest issues is about when you're talking about what levels which are able to manage cities, you find that the leaders that are supposed to influence issues of public participation, which is a very big issue because they're able to bring their cronies, they're able to bring their friends to participate and allocate budgets to non-existent projects, and also it affects issues of development where money is allocated to a lot of trips, and that becomes a very big. So on my closing remarks, so that I wind up, and so I wish to thank everybody that I've met here, and those also shared their points. Two things comes to me for the cities. One is that the city does not exist in a vacuum. The city is not for the elite. The city is for the poor. The majority of the poor people are found within the informal settlements. So any innovation that you come up with must address the people, the real people. When you're talking about people who cannot use vehicles, people who want to use public transport. What is their public transport? The issue of river sanitation is a big issue, and water within the cities. What kind of low-tech innovations do we have? And then the last thing that we need also to look at the future of work We're talking about the future of work now. Everybody's moved now to their laptops and maybe in their homes and in wherever they're working. What is it for people who are the 80% or the 60%? They don't have access to laptops. They don't have access to to internet. How do you bring them there? Do we need an advocacy strategy for them so that we can have good network, 5G networks, have them literacy, put it in the curriculum so that our children can understand what you're talking about? When Bill Gates talks, also an African child talks in Kenya or South Africa, understand what you're talking about. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Rapudo, for those closing statements. And I think that is very much a reminder. Yes, indeed, cities are not about the elites; they're about the majority of the population who do not live in our Twitterverse and our world of agency and capacity. Moving on, Soups, any closing remarks from you?
Thanks, Danga. Yeah, I think for me, you know, what the pandemic has done is given us an opportunity to reset. And when we think about rebuild and recover, we shouldn't think in small terms. We should be brave and bold and do things differently. And as much as we can speak about governance and legislation, etc., I think there are many opportunities that we've not tapped and we've not even realized we can tap into that. I think those are some things we can do. Just to mention like a couple, I think one of the areas is to let go. There's some things you should let go and do less of. And there's other things you should do more of. And so I think there's certain compliances which I just think doesn't make sense, like the issues around, you know, the informal trade and the informal economy, about how we manage that. That's an area that certainly you need to let go. I also think, and I'll leave it with this, that we've not really tapped into how practitioners can change as a practitioner movement that works with a political movement and supportive policy and legislation of how we can shift and transform local government to something different. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Soups. If I could then go over to Duduzi for closing remarks based on what you've heard and some additional thoughts you may have brought to the table.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to participate in the Urban Festival. I think I agree with Rapudo that cities are about the people, and therefore people must be at the center of development in cities. And COVID-19 has really emphasized that point, that cities must also be what you call the leadership of cities must be people. So those that lead cities must resonate with the people, so that there's a gentleman in this room that used to work with civil society. He was even younger than even today. He still does that, because it happened when there was UDF, there was all of this. So Andrew's experience on working with civil society is very, very important. So if cities are not able to create those partnerships with civil society, we are not going to be able to advance the agenda of cities. But also cities must be allowed to play a meaningful role in the economy, in the health of their residents. And I want to also add in the education of its residents, because you take a case of a city region like us, we want to be a globally competitive city region, but you find that we are not in a position to dictate on the kind of skills and investment. But so working with universities, research institutions, we've got to do that. And cities must be allowed to really play a bigger role on spatial transformation issues such as transport, an important area that, interestingly, Andrew, I had a webinar with Premier Windy on the issues of transport, that cities, metro systems, and all those things, because many of our people are far in the far-flung parts of the city, but for them to be closer, whether the BRT system, stitching of the city, you need to create, whether it's a polycentric approach that you think about, but invest where people are at. So the township economy idea that we have in the Gauteng city region, it's about investing where people are at. So really, for us, the COVID-19 has given us that latitude, and we're speeding ahead with those kinds of thinking and ideas, so that indeed the cities can become inclusive in their development and in their intervention. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nduduzi, for those remarks. And last but not least, Andrew, if I could ask you for some closing comments.
Danga, firstly, the bad news. I see that Eskom's going to level 4 in 6 minutes. So I hope it doesn't affect the rest of the conference. They seem to be battling. So I'd like to pick up on both the previous comments of Nduduzi on partnerships, as well as Suze's emphasis on city leadership. And link it back. Firstly, you said, should cities be more autonomous or maybe have more powers? And I don't think that's the starting point. I think it's more cities using their existing powers to play more of a broader leadership role, rather than asking for more powers. And I think that South African Cities Network has a critical role to play in this regard. I think city leaders need to step up beyond municipal mandates, because they've been getting, in my experience, a narrower and narrower approach to trying to deal with complex societal issues. So it's either finger pointing to other spheres of government. It's you haven't delivered, and we being affected, or it's not our mandate, don't accuse us, or the terror of unfunded mandates. And I think that we should be talking about city mandates, not just municipal mandates, and that empowers city leaders to convene the right people in the room around water or energy or transport and mobility. It's not to say that those are all municipal mandates, because they're not. Some are national, some are provincial, some are local, and some need business support or community support. But it's about the city's role in convening the right people in the room to address, let's say, future energy supply. Whoever's legal mandate it is, the city needs to have a leadership role in ensuring energy security for their city. And they're not stepping up to that. They're hiding behind mandatism in many cases, municipal mandates. And I think we need to talk about city leadership mandates and not just local government mandates. Thanks, Danga.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And I'd like to very much take this opportunity to thank all the panelists who participated today. Thank you for taking the time, Rupado, Nduduzi, Subs, and Andrew, for giving us your insights based on your experiences on this question of innovation within city government, and how we can actually, some of the challenges that we've seen, some of the things that we have identified as a group that we could focus on moving forward. As we come to the end of this session, I would also like to thank the team behind the scenes who've been making sure that things run so seamlessly. All the colleagues who've been showing videos, you had sent out the invitations and are running the platforms that enable us to keep this going. And in closing, I just wanted to remind us at the Davos a few years ago, there was a clip that went viral of a economist, a Dutch economic historian, Rutger Bregman, who was talking about with Winnie de Nyama, who is the head of Oxfam, and was saying that we must introduce a wealth tax on the world's richest people, which you can imagine in the Davos audience that did not land very well, but the rest of the world were cheering and clapping, because that's the kind of progressive, innovative thing that could change systemic issues that we face in our societies. And Bregman, in some of his writings, speaks about, and he quotes Milton Friedman, who says that change only happens in the face of a crisis. So it's when in the face of a crisis, change can happen, but that is predicated on having the ideas to implement at that time. I think based on our discussion today, we can say definitively that there are many ideas that have come up, and indeed were shared on the chat, shared by our panelists, in terms of addressing the crisis in governance, perhaps, that the COVID-19 pandemic and circumstances before that had exposed to us too. So with that, I hope that our participants, and thank you very much to our participants for having joined, and I hope that we've planted some seeds, and indeed that you will apply your own leadership. We can all be leaders in whatever sphere of society we're in, to perhaps see some of these changes that will make for the better life for all and a better society that we all envisage for all of us. So thank you very much for participating. I'd like to remind you that the Urban Festival, ESCOM permitting, continues through the week. We have continuing sessions this afternoon, tomorrow, and on Friday. This recording of the session we posted to the Urban Festival website, and please urge you to go to www.urbanfestival.co.za and also to register for additional sessions and to continue in this tail end of the October Urban Month with the Urban Festival. Thanks very much and goodbye. Thanks very much, everyone, and goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Bye, bye, bye.